Slavery was the backbone of ancient Roman society, deeply woven into its economy, culture, and daily life. Unlike modern conceptions of slavery, which are often tied exclusively to race, Roman slavery was a complex institution that cut across ethnic and social lines. Slaves in Rome came from conquered territories, debt bondage, piracy, or even born into slavery. Their lives were defined by the whims of their owners, and their social status was that of property rather than human beings with legal rights. The Roman economy relied heavily on slave labor, particularly in agriculture, mining, domestic service, and even in professional roles such as teachers, accountants, and physicians. Large agricultural estates known as latifundia were run almost entirely by slaves. These estates produced the grain, olives, and wine that fed the urban population of Rome and supported its expanding empire. While the scale of labor on these estates varied, the work was often grueling, with slaves enduring long hours under harsh conditions. The economic importance of slaves meant that they were constantly subject to control, discipline, and surveillance. Owners had absolute authority, and punishments for disobedience could be severe, ranging from beatings to execution. Female slaves occupied a particularly precarious position within Roman households. Their roles were multifaceted. They were caretakers, cooks, laundresses, tutors, and companions. Some were also exploited sexually, either openly or under the guise of domestic service. Women's reproductive capacity added another layer to their exploitation. In a society that valued population growth and economic productivity, the ability of female slaves to bear children could be both an asset and a liability. Children born to slaves automatically became the property of the owner, reinforcing the cycle of enslavement. At the same time, pregnancy could limit a woman's ability to perform certain tasks, prompting owners to exercise strict control over reproductive matters. The social hierarchy of Roman society placed free citizens at the top and slaves at the bottom. Yet slaves were not a homogeneous group. Some were educated and held important positions within households, gaining a measure of prestige and influence despite their lack of legal freedom. For instance, Greek slaves were often prized for their literacy and teaching abilities, while others served as personal attendants to elite Roman families. However, regardless of education or skill, slaves remained subject to ownership and could be bought, sold, or traded at their master's discretion. Legal frameworks reinforced the status of slaves as property. The ius vitae necisque, the right of life and death, granted owners complete authority over their slaves, including the ability to punish, mutilate, or kill them without legal consequence. Slaves could not legally marry, although they often formed personal relationships and families informally. The children of slaves, however, were considered property from birth, perpetuating the generational cycle of servitude. Even in instances where slaves could earn or purchase freedom, known as manumission, they often remained socially and economically marginalized, tethered to the very society that had enslaved them. Roman slavery was not only an economic institution but also a cultural one. The presence of slaves was deeply normalized in daily life, shaping social customs and household dynamics. Elite families measured their status by the number and quality of slaves they owned, turning human beings into markers of wealth and prestige. Slaves performed essential tasks that allowed their owners to pursue public office, leisure, and cultural pursuits, making their labor both invisible and indispensable. In many ways, the entire structure of Roman society depended on the subjugation and exploitation of these individuals. Yet the lives of slaves were not devoid of agency. Despite systemic oppression, slaves resisted in subtle and overt ways. Some engaged in acts of sabotage, escape attempts, or even open rebellion. Historical records describe uprisings such as the famous revolt led by Spartacus, in which thousands of enslaved men and women fought against Roman forces. Within households, female slaves could influence family dynamics through caretaking, manipulation, or intimate relationships with their owners. While these acts rarely resulted in freedom or legal recognition, they reveal the complex human realities behind the institution of slavery. The role of female slaves in particular reflected the intersection of labor, gender, and power in Rome. Women were expected to be industrious, obedient, and sexually available, often simultaneously. Pregnancy introduced additional complexities. On one hand, a female slave's child increased the owner's wealth as the child became new property. On the other hand, pregnancy could be seen as a disruption to labor or a threat to control, leading owners to intervene in deeply personal aspects of their slaves' lives. In extreme cases, measures such as forced abortions, infanticide, or exposure of newborns were employed to regulate reproduction and maintain authority. This duality, valuing reproduction while punishing its natural consequences, underscored the harsh realities of female slavery in Rome. The Roman reliance on slavery was so profound that it shaped every facet of society, from law to economy to cultural norms. It was a system built on power, control, and the commodification of human beings. Female slaves occupied a uniquely vulnerable position within this system, simultaneously essential and expendable. Their bodies, labor, and reproductive capabilities were tools for economic gain, social prestige, and household management. Understanding the role of slavery in Roman society is crucial to grasping the broader context of what happened to pregnant female slaves, and why such practices, though abhorrent by modern standards, were embedded in the structures of the time. In summary, slavery in ancient Rome was more than mere labor. It was a foundational institution that dictated social hierarchies, economic productivity, and daily life. Female slaves were the invisible engines of households and estates, performing critical labor while navigating an environment of strict control and exploitation. Pregnancy added an additional layer of complexity, highlighting how the institution of slavery extended its reach into the most intimate aspects of human life. The stories of these women, largely absent from mainstream historical narratives, reveal the deeply personal and often tragic dimensions of Roman slavery, setting the stage for understanding the darker practices that would follow. Pregnancy among female slaves in ancient Rome was a subject that lay at the intersection of economics, social hierarchy, and the absolute power of slave owners. Unlike free women, whose pregnancies were tied to family, lineage, and social standing, the pregnancy of a slave carried implications entirely dictated by the desires and interests of her master. In Roman society, the human body of a female slave was simultaneously labor, commodity, and potential progenitor of further property. This created a tension. While pregnancy could increase the wealth of the owner, it could also disrupt household operations or challenge the master's control over his property. As a result, pregnancy among female slaves was heavily monitored, regulated, and sometimes violently controlled. In Roman households and estates, the reproductive capacity of female slaves was often seen as an economic asset. Children born to enslaved women automatically became the property of their mother's owner, regardless of the father's status. This principle made the fertility of female slaves a matter of economic calculation. On large agricultural estates, latifundia, where labor was the primary source of wealth, owners sometimes encouraged the reproduction of slaves to increase the size of their workforce without the need for purchasing new slaves. This practice is sometimes referred to by historians as slave breeding, although it was rarely systematic in the sense of organized programs, except in certain elite households or wealthy urban estates. Yet, the reproductive role of female slaves was not universally encouraged. Pregnancy could severely limit a woman's ability to perform essential labor tasks, such as cooking, cleaning, carrying heavy loads, or working in the fields. In some cases, pregnant slaves were seen as liabilities rather than assets, particularly if the household or estate was under economic strain. Owners could become impatient or even hostile toward pregnancy, seeing it as a disruption to their productivity. Historical records indicate that some slaves were pressured to abort pregnancies, either through coercion or the use of herbal remedies. Reflecting the brutal calculation of reproductive control in Roman society, the sexual exploitation of female slaves compounded these issues, Sexual abuse was widespread and often institutionalized, though it was rarely acknowledged in Roman legal texts in the sense of wrongdoing against a slave. The master's sexual access to female slaves was not considered a crime, as slaves were legally property rather than citizens with autonomy. In some cases, pregnancy resulted from the master himself, in others, from other male slaves or outsiders. Regardless of the source, the pregnancy became the property of the household, reinforcing the dehumanizing reality that slave women were considered instruments for labor and reproduction. Pregnancy also carried social and psychological consequences for female slaves. While slaves were legally denied personal rights, the physical and emotional demands of pregnancy could still be profound. Many slaves endured pregnancies without medical care, adequate nutrition, or rest. Complications could be fatal, and the lack of protection or empathy from owners magnified the dangers. Furthermore, the knowledge that their children would belong to their owners and that they might face separation or exploitation added emotional trauma to the already grueling physical realities of enslavement. The legal framework of Rome provided little recourse for pregnant slaves. The Lex Julia et Papia, which governed marriage and procreation for Roman citizens, did not extend to slaves. Instead, the reproductive rights of enslaved women were entirely controlled by the owner's discretion. In extreme cases, owners could order abortions, expose infants to die, or even force mothers to work through late pregnancy and shortly after childbirth. Some wealthy estates reportedly incentivized slave breeding through rewards or improved living conditions for fertile women, though these incentives were small compared to the overall exploitation they endured. Historical accounts provide glimpses into these harsh realities. Ancient writers such as Pliny, Juvenal, and Seneca, while often writing from elite perspectives, allude to the commodification of slave bodies and the economic motivations underlying their treatment. Pliny describes wealthy estates where female slaves were valued for their ability to produce children, while Seneca criticizes the moral decay of masters who treated human beings purely as instruments for wealth. Such records highlight the tension between the economic benefits of slave reproduction and the dehumanizing practices it often entailed. Pregnancy also carried legal and social implications for the household. While free women's pregnancies were often celebrated, those of slaves were functional and utilitarian. The birth of a child could enhance the owner's wealth if the child survived, but it could also create additional logistical challenges, such as the need to provide care or accommodate infants in the household. In some cases, infants born to slaves were placed under the care of wet nurses or other enslaved women, further entrenching the hierarchy and exploiting the reproductive labor of multiple women simultaneously. The role of pregnancy in the broader economy of slavery was also significant. Male and female slaves were expensive commodities. Owners invested in their health and survival primarily to protect their economic value. Pregnancy, therefore, became a factor in calculating labor, productivity, and future revenue. Women who were considered valuable for their reproductive potential might receive slightly better food or shelter, yet this benefit was purely instrumental, designed to ensure the survival of the mother and child for the owner's gain. These calculations reflect the deeply utilitarian logic that underpinned Roman slavery, where every aspect of a slave's life, including pregnancy, was subject to economic analysis. Cultural attitudes toward pregnancy among slaves were equally instrumental. In literature, satire, and even moral philosophy, Roman writers often depicted the reproduction of slaves as a necessary but morally ambivalent aspect of society. Pregnant female slaves were objects of both concern and contempt, valued for their capacity to generate new property, yet disregarded as individuals with their own rights or desires. This duality reveals a society in which human life was subordinated to wealth, power, and social prestige, particularly for women at the bottom of the social hierarchy. In conclusion, pregnancy among female slaves in ancient Rome was a complex phenomenon shaped by the interplay of economics, labor, social hierarchy, and exploitation. Female slaves were simultaneously valuable and vulnerable, as their reproductive capacity could enhance the wealth of their owners. while exposing them to coercion, violence, and extreme control. The lives of these women illuminate the harsh realities of Roman slavery, highlighting how deeply personal aspects of human life were subordinated to the demands of property and power. Understanding these dynamics is essential to grasping the broader consequences of slavery in Rome, particularly the ways in which gender, labor, and reproduction were manipulated to serve the interests of the elite. The story of pregnant female slaves is thus a story of survival, suffering, and systemic exploitation, a dark chapter in Roman history that reveals the human cost of one of history's most powerful empires. While pregnancy among female slaves in ancient Rome could theoretically be an economic asset, the reality for many women was far darker. The Roman institution of slavery prioritized the wealth, convenience, and control of the master above the health and autonomy of the enslaved. As a result, practices such as forced abortions, infant exposure, and even infanticide were not uncommon, particularly when pregnancies were deemed inconvenient, unwanted, or economically disadvantageous. These practices were grim reminders of the extreme dehumanization inherent in Roman slavery and reveal the lethal consequences of seeing women and their children as property rather than human beings. Abortion and coerced reproductive control. Abortion, or the deliberate termination of pregnancy, was a practice known and sometimes used in ancient Rome, though legal and social attitudes toward it were complex. For free Roman citizens, abortion carried moral and legal scrutiny, particularly under laws designed to encourage population growth among citizens. However, for enslaved women, these societal and legal protections largely did not apply. Female slaves were considered property, and their owners had nearly absolute control over their bodies. Consequently, if a slave's pregnancy was deemed inconvenient, whether because it reduced her labor productivity, interfered with household management, or conflicted with the owner's personal desires, the master could compel an abortion. Historical records and medical texts suggest that various methods were employed, ranging from herbal remedies to physical coercion. Roman medical writers, such as Soranus of Ephesus, documented the use of abortifacient herbs, some of which were likely toxic or dangerous. Slaves may have been forced to ingest these substances or subjected to physical manipulations, intended to terminate the pregnancy. The risks were extreme. Infections, hemorrhaging, and death were not uncommon. Yet, the economic calculus often outweighed concern for the woman's health. The survival of the owner's household or estate took precedence over the life of the pregnant slave, infant exposure, and the fate of the newborn. In addition to forced abortions, infant exposure was another method by which masters exerted control over reproduction. Exposure involved leaving a newborn, often in a public place, in the wilderness, or by the roadside, where survival was highly unlikely. Unlike deliberate murder, exposure relied on the high infant mortality rate and the environment to eliminate the child. While exposure could sometimes result in the child being taken in by strangers or sold into slavery elsewhere, in practice, many infants died within hours or days. The practice of exposure was not unique to slaves. It was used in Roman society more broadly, particularly when parents were unable or unwilling to care for a child. However, in the context of slavery, exposure reflected the absolute disregard for the life of enslaved children and the utilitarian view of reproduction. Infants were considered valuable only insofar as they served the economic interests of their owners. If a child did not fit into that framework, exposure became a convenient tool to maintain control over household labor and resources. Infanticide and extreme measures. In the most extreme cases, infanticide, the deliberate killing of a newborn, was employed to eliminate unwanted children of slaves. While less commonly documented than exposure, infanticide was a reality in certain households or estates, particularly in urban environments where labor and space were limited. Sources from Roman historians and moralists occasionally hint at the brutal measures some masters were willing to take to maintain authority and economic efficiency. The very fact that these actions could be carried out without legal consequence underscores the total control Roman owners held over their slaves and the absolute vulnerability of enslaved women and their children. The morality of these practices was often debated in Roman literature and philosophy, but rarely in terms of the rights of the enslaved themselves. Writers such as Seneca criticized the moral corruption of masters who treated human life purely as an instrument for wealth. Juvenal's satires similarly highlighted the cruelty of elite households, using exaggeration to underscore the ethical rot within Roman society. These critiques, while not legally enforceable, offer insight into the contemporary awareness that such practices were morally troubling, even if economically rationalized. The psychological and social impact on female slaves, the threat of abortion, exposure, or infanticide created profound psychological pressure on enslaved women. The No alleged that their pregnancies could be terminated or their children abandoned at any moment contributed to a climate of fear, helplessness, and trauma. Mothers often had little or no agency in decisions about their own bodies or the survival of their children. This trauma was compounded by the daily burdens of labor and the constant threat of violence. In many cases, enslaved women would have to continue performing physically demanding tasks while pregnant or immediately after giving birth, with minimal rest or care. Socially, the presence of these practices reinforced the total domination of the master over the household. Other slaves witnessed the consequences of pregnancy and learned that reproduction was not a private matter, but a regulated aspect of property management. This created a system in which female slaves were hyper-aware of their vulnerability and the economic value of their bodies. Trust, personal autonomy, and family formation were almost impossible, as even the most natural and human experiences, pregnancy and childbirth, were controlled and manipulated for the benefit of the owner. Economic logic behind these practices, the brutal reality of abortion, exposure, and infanticide, was closely tied to the economic logic of Roman slavery. Children of slaves represented future property and labor, but only if their survival and integration aligned with the owner's interests. In cases where estates were overpopulated, resources were scarce, or the child threatened to disrupt household operations, controlling reproduction became a matter of financial prudence. Female slaves were evaluated in terms of their productivity and reproductive potential, and measures that might seem morally abhorrent today were often rationalized as practical necessities in the context of maintaining wealth and labor efficiency. Furthermore, these practices reflect a broader societal view of slaves as expendable tools. Unlike free citizens, whose legal and social protections could shield them from direct harm, enslaved women were seen as instruments whose value was conditional, subject to modification or termination at the discretion of the owner. The extreme measures taken to regulate reproduction highlight the degree to which slavery dehumanized women, reducing intimate and life-altering events to matters of property and profit. Cultural reflections and historical memory. Although Roman society accepted these practices as part of the larger institution of slavery, later historians and scholars view them as emblematic of the extreme cruelty inherent in the system. The treatment of pregnant female slaves, including forced abortions and infanticide, underscores the intersection of gender, power, and exploitation. It also challenges modern audiences to confront the deeply personal costs of slavery, not only the loss of freedom, but the violation of bodily autonomy and the destruction of family bonds. These dark realities remind us that the economic prosperity and social grandeur of Rome were built, in part, on the suffering and subjugation of the most vulnerable. In conclusion, the harsh realities faced by pregnant female slaves in ancient Rome, ranging from coerced abortions to infant exposure and infanticide, reveal the grim consequences of a system that treated human beings as property. Pregnancy, which might naturally be celebrated as a life-affirming event, became a site of danger, control, and violence. These practices were justified economically and socially, reflecting a society in which wealth and power took precedence over the most basic human rights. The experiences of these women illuminate the human cost of Roman slavery and set the stage for understanding the broader consequences for slave mothers and their children. A story of suffering and survival that has left an indelible mark on history. The birth of a child to a female slave in ancient Rome was a moment that was far from purely personal or familial. It was an event defined entirely by the social, economic, and legal framework of slavery. In Roman society, children of slaves automatically inherited the status of their mothers, which meant they were considered the property of their mother's owner from the moment of birth. This reality had profound consequences for both mothers and children, shaping their lives from the very first moments and highlighting the deep dehumanization inherent in Roman slavery. The legal status of children born to slaves. Under Roman law, the principle of partus sequitur ventrum dictated that the offspring of a slave woman were themselves slaves, belonging to the same owner as their mother. This rule applied regardless of the father's status, whether free or enslaved. The legal framework effectively erased any personal identity or rights the child might have had, ensuring that slavery perpetuated itself across generations. Owners had complete discretion over the lives of these children, controlling their upbringing, labor, and even life or death in extreme circumstances. The hereditary nature of slavery meant that female slaves' reproductive capacity was a tool of economic production. Owners could derive immediate benefit from the labor of the mother and long-term benefit from the future labor of her children. In wealthier households or large agricultural estates, this cycle of property and labor became a self-perpetuating system. The children grew to replace or augment the workforce, minimizing the need for additional purchases from slave markets. Yet, the benefits to the owner came at an enormous human cost, as both mothers and children were stripped of autonomy and subjected to exploitation from birth. Raising children under the shadow of ownership, slave mothers often faced the impossible task of raising their children under conditions that prioritized the needs of the household over maternal care. Infants and young children were frequently placed in the care of wet nurses, often other enslaved women, or releg, aided to communal child-rearing arrangements. While this system allowed mothers to continue performing laborious tasks, it also meant that the intimate bond between mother and child was severely disrupted. The emotional trauma of separation was compounded by the knowledge that the child legally belonged to someone else, a realization that could be devastating in urban households. Children of slaves were sometimes given minimal supervision, left to survive on the margins of the family's attention. In agricultural estates, the children might be used in light labor from an early age, learning skills and duties necessary for future productivity. While some children survived and even thrived, their lives were dictated by labor expectations rather than developmental needs or personal choice. The mother's ability to influence or protect her child was severely limited, reinforcing the pervasive power imbalance of the institution. Economic implications for the mother. The birth of a child could both increase and complicate the economic value of a female slave. On one hand, a child born to a female slave represented an increase in the owner's wealth as the infant was immediately added to the property and labor pool. Some owners saw fertile women as particularly valuable and may have offered marginally better living conditions, food, or status to incentivize reproductive output. However, these benefits were never for the mother's well-being. They were strictly calculated to protect the owner's investment and future profit. On the other hand, pregnancy and child-rearing temporarily reduced a mother's ability to perform labor, particularly in physically demanding roles such as fieldwork or heavy domestic duties. This created a tension between the owner's short-term economic interests and the long-term benefits of reproduction. In some cases, this tension led to brutal measures, including forced abortions, early return to labor postpartum, or, in extreme situations, the death of infants deemed inconvenient. Mothers lived under constant pressure to perform both labor and reproductive duties, a dual burden that exemplified the extreme exploitation embedded in Roman slavery. Emotional and psychological realities. The emotional toll on slave mothers cannot be understated. While historical sources focus largely on legal and economic perspectives, the lived experience of these women involved profound psychological suffering, slave mothers were acutely aware that their children were not legally theirs, and that any child they bore could be sold, removed, or exposed to their owner's discretion. This awareness created a persistent state of anxiety, grief, and helplessness. Even when children survived, the bonds of affection were complicated by the knowledge that these bonds were not recognized legally or socially. Despite these harsh realities, slave mothers often formed deep attachments to their children, providing care, comfort, and education whenever possible. Mothers would sometimes protect their infants from excessive labor or shield them from harsh punishment, negotiating with overseers or leveraging their own value to the household. These acts of maternal care, though constrained, reveal the resilience and agency that women maintained even within an oppressive system. Motherhood became a quiet form of resistance, a way to assert humanity and nurture life in an environment designed to strip both away. The fate of children in adulthood. Children born to slaves faced a lifetime shaped by their inherited status. As they grew, they were trained in labor appropriate to the household or estate. Boys might be assigned agricultural work, construction, or servitude in the master's urban estate, while girls were often groomed for domestic roles, including cooking, cleaning, laundering, or even sexual servitude. Education for slave children, when available, was designed to enhance their utility rather than personal development. In rare cases, children might receive training in literacy, trade skills, or household management if their labor was deemed valuable to the household economy. Some children eventually gained freedom through manumission, often contingent on the wishes of the owner or as a reward for exceptional service. However, manumitted slaves and their children remained socially and economically marginalized, frequently tethered to the same house, olds, or estates where they were born. For the majority, life as a slave was a continuum of labor, control, and limited opportunity, a stark reminder of how reproductive exploitation perpetuated the cycle of bondage across generations. Social implications, and broader consequences. The experiences of slave mothers and their children illuminate the broader social dynamics of Roman slavery. Motherhood among slaves was not a private, nurturing role as in free society. It was subordinated to the demands of property, labor, and control. Children were economic assets first and human beings second, and their survival and development were shaped by the priorities of their owners rather than family or community. This system reinforced social hierarchies, legitimized exploitation, and normalized the commodification of human life. Culturally, the presence of slave mothers and children also reinforced the status of free citizens. The labor of slaves, combined with the reproductive continuity of their population, allowed Roman citizens to enjoy wealth, leisure, and social prestige without directly engaging in manual labor. The household, estate, and empire as a whole were sustained by this reproductive economy, a reality that underscores the deeply entwined nature of slavery and social structure in ancient Rome. Conclusion: slave mothers in ancient Rome navigated an environment of profound exploitation and control where every aspect of their lives, including pregnancy, childbirth, and child rearing, was dictated by the economic and social interests of their owners. Their children were born into bondage, trained to serve, and often separated from maternal care, perpetuating cycles of exploitation and dependency. Yet, within this oppressive framework, female slaves demonstrated resilience, maternal care, and agency wherever possible, asserting humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The lives of these women and their children reveal the intergenerational consequences of slavery, illustrating how reproductive control and labor exploitation shaped not only individual destinies, but the broader structure of Roman society. Understanding the experiences of slave mothers is essential to comprehending the human cost of the empire's wealth, power, and social order, highlighting the profound ways in which slavery penetrated the most intimate aspects of life and reshaped family, identity, and survival. The dark realities faced by pregnant female slaves in ancient Rome, the coercion, forced abortions, exposure, infanticide, and the exploitation of their children, left a legacy that resonates across history, both as a cautionary tale and as a reminder of the human cost of systemic oppression. While the direct accounts of these women are sparse due to their lack of legal recognition and the selective nature of historical record-keeping, historians have pieced together evidence from legal texts, literary sources, archaeological findings, and comparative studies of slavery throughout the ancient world. This legacy forces us to confront not only the cruelty inherent in Roman slavery, but also the broader patterns of human exploitation that persist in different forms across societies and eras. Understanding the historical context to appreciate the legacy of these practices, it is crucial to situate them within the broader Roman social, economic, and legal framework. Slavery in Rome was not incidental, it was fundamental to the economy, culture, and political structure. The labor of enslaved individuals enabled the construction of monumental architecture, the expansion of agricultural estates, and the leisure of Rome's elite classes. Pregnant female slaves and their children represented a dual economic function, immediate labor and future labor potential. This utilitarian perspective, codified in legal principles such as partus sequitur ventrum, demonstrates how deeply the reproductive capacities of enslaved women were integrated into the functioning of the empire. Historians note that the experiences of these women cannot be divorced from their social status. Unlike free women, whose pregnancies were framed around family, lineage, and social continuity, female slaves had no legal claim to their bodies or their offspring. Their reproductive lives were directly subordinated to the economic interests of their owners, reflecting a systemic devaluation of their humanity. This structural violence, embedded in law, custom, and economic practice, shaped not only individual fates, but the trajectory of Roman society as a whole. Lessons from Roman moralists and writers. Ancient Roman writers offer insight into contemporary perceptions of these practices, albeit from the perspective of elite observers. Philosophers and moralists, such as Seneca, Pliny, and Juvenal, commented on the cruelty of wealthy households and the moral corruption that accompanied the exploitation of slaves. Seneca, for instance, criticized masters who treated human beings as mere instruments of profit, highlighting the ethical costs of reducing life to property. Juvenal's satirical writings lampooned the excesses of the elite, using exaggeration to underline the societal acceptance of cruelty toward slaves, including their reproductive exploitation. While these critiques were limited in scope and did not translate into legal reform for slaves, they provide evidence that Roman society was aware, at least in part, of the moral ambiguities surrounding slavery. These reflections have become invaluable to modern historians seeking to reconstruct the lived experiences of enslaved women and the ethical dimensions of Roman social structures. They remind us that even in societies where oppression is normalized, there are always voices that recognize injustice, however muted. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence. Archaeology and epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, further illuminate the legacy of these practices. Burial sites of enslaved individuals, sometimes discovered alongside their children, provide tangible evidence of infant mortality and the harsh conditions under which slave families lived. Inscriptions and epitaphs occasionally record the names of enslaved women, their children, and, in rare cases, the conditions of their labor or household status. These findings, while fragmentary, humanize the historical record, offering glimpses into the personal lives and struggles of women who are otherwise invisible in literary sources. Archaeological analysis also sheds light on the material conditions that shape the experiences of pregnant slaves. The layout of Roman villas, with separate quarters for enslaved laborers, kitchens, and nurseries, reflects the spatial segregation and control exercised over their lives. Tools, implements, and dietary remnants reveal the physically demanding labor and limited nutrition that would have affected both pregnant women and their infants. These material traces underscore the vulnerability of female slaves and the systemic constraints placed upon their reproductive lives. Comparative studies and broader implications. The legacy of reproductive control over enslaved women in Rome resonates beyond the ancient world. Comparative studies of slavery in the Americas, the Caribbean, and other historical contexts reveal striking parallels. Enslaved women were often coerced into pregnancies, denied autonomy over their bodies, and separated from their children for the economic benefit of their owners. By examining these patterns across time and space, historians and sociologists can trace how systemic exploitation of women's reproductive labor has been a recurring feature of patriarchal and slave-based societies. This perspective allows us to view Roman practices not as isolated cruelty, but as part of a broader continuum of human oppression that has persisted in different forms throughout history. The ethical and cultural legacy, the ethical implications of Roman reproductive control are profound. The stories of pregnant female slaves challenge modern audiences to consider the ways in which human life can be commodified, and how systems of power manipulate the most intimate aspects of existence for economic or political gain. These historical lessons inform contemporary discussions about human rights, bodily autonomy, and gender-based exploitation. They highlight the need to recognize the humanity of individuals whose labor and reproductive capacity are undervalued or coerced, whether in historical slavery or in modern contexts of trafficking, coercion, or forced labor. Culturally, the narratives of these women contribute to a more complete understanding of Roman society. While Rome is often remembered for its grandeur, architectural achievements, and political innovations, the experiences of enslaved women reveal the hidden human cost of this civilization's wealth and power. Acknowledging this darker side of history does not diminish the accomplishments of Roman society. Rather, it provides a fuller, more nuanced picture of the empire, one that recognizes the suffering and resilience of those who lived at the margins. Historical memory and modern scholarship, modern historians continue to grapple with how to reconstruct and interpret the experiences of pregnant female slaves. The scarcity of direct testimonies makes the work challenging, requiring careful reading of legal texts, literature, and archaeological evidence. Scholars such as Keith Bradley, Sandra Joschel, and Suzanne Dixon have emphasized the importance of centering the perspectives of enslaved women in historical analysis, exploring how their lives were shaped by systemic exploitation while acknowledging their agency within oppressive structures. This scholarship not only recovers the voices of the marginalized, but also challenges the dominant narratives that have traditionally celebrated Roman achievements without recognizing the suffering upon which they were built. Moreover, these historical reflections influence broader cultural consciousness, from education to media portrayals of slavery in antiquity. By highlighting the reproductive exploitation of female slaves, historians encourage audiences to confront the ethical dimensions of power, property, and gender that continue to resonate today. The legacy of Roman slavery is not merely a relic of the past. It serves as a lens through which we can examine ongoing issues of inequality, human rights violations, and systemic oppression. Conclusion. The legacy of pregnant female slaves in ancient Rome is multifaceted, encompassing legal, economic, social, and ethical dimensions. Their experiences illuminate the profound ways in which slavery dehumanized women, controlled reproduction, and shaped entire generations. At the same time, these stories reveal resilience, maternal care, and agency within the confines of an oppressive system. By reflecting on these histories, we gain a deeper understanding of the human cost of Roman power and the enduring consequences of slavery across time and cultures. The treatment of pregnant female slaves reminds us that economic prosperity and social prestige often came at the expense of the most vulnerable, and that historical memory must include the voices and experiences of those who were marginalized. The dark realities of reproductive control in ancient Rome continue to resonate today, offering lessons about justice, ethics, and the value of human life in the face of systemic exploitation.